Evening, everybody. Thanks, Joel. Hi there. I'm David Kent. I'm one of the co-chairs of the program committee for the Northumberland Learning Connection. And it's my turn tonight to introduce our speaker tonight, which is Professor Jennifer Clapp, who's going to be speaking on geopolitics and the global food system. Before we get going, I'm going to start off with the land acknowledgement. This place where we gather tonight is located on the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississauga and Chippewa nations. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care and teachings about our earth and relations. May we honor those teachings. And in that vein, may we benefit from the teachings tonight. Just a show of hands, how many people were here last week for Dave Donnan? Wow. Was anybody not here last week for Dave Donnan? Okay. I'm going to ignore all of you, and I'm just going to speak to the people who were here last week for Dave Donnan, because those of you who were here saw that what his role was really to provide an overview and do a bit of scene setting for our program on food. And that, by its nature, left a lot of strings dangling, and left a lot of questions begged. And Jennifer is the first of the presenters who are now going to follow up and on some of the issues that Dave left open and that he illuminated. And she's fabulously qualified to speak to us tonight. She is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability and a professor in the School of Environment, Resources and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. And for those of you who don't know what a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair is, and I didn't until recently, a Tier 1 chair is an outstanding researcher acknowledged by their peers as a world leader in her field. And so that's who we have tonight. Fun local fact, Jennifer started off her academic career actually at York, I think, but then very quickly found her way to just north of Rice Lake to Trent University, where she taught for 5 years, so there's a bit of local. She's down in Waterloo now, I know, but she started off really got going at Trent. Now, Jennifer's current research topics are the rise of mega companies and corporate concentration in the agri-food space. We heard a bit about that from Dave last week. And she's got a new book out. You can look for it. It's called Titans of Industrial Agriculture, How a Few Giant Corporations Came to Dominate the Farm Sector and Why It Matters. It's reasonably clear what that's about, but it's an important book, and you should have a look at it. She's also looking these days at the environmental dimensions of global agriculture, trade, investment, aid, and financing. So it's a wide range of interests that Jennifer is pursuing. She's widely quoted. She's quoted everywhere from CBC to CNN, from the New York Times to Le Monde, and I have no doubt that you will be quoting her tomorrow to all those of your friends when you're telling them what they missed tonight. And so without more, Jennifer, the stage is yours.
Sorry, Jennifer.
It's okay. Awesome. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, David. And I'm really happy to be here. And sorry, I'm sure you understand I might need my other pair of glasses. But as David said, I do work on the intersection of the global economy and the global food system and have a lot of passion about my work around implications of economic relationships in the global economy and their implications for people's food security. And it's a really interesting area of research. It's never boring. There's always something going on because food is actually one of the most political topics that there is out there. It's important for obviously our nourishment on every day, but it's important in terms of the way that nations think about their own national security. They want to be sure that they can feed their own populations. It's important for states in terms of political dynamics, because the farm sector and farm constituency are important voting blocks in most countries. And also the farm sector is really important for livelihoods, for people, for food producers. And we often, don't necessarily think about the fact that it's not just producers, but also food system workers. They're some of the most important workers in our food system. We know that because during COVID, they were considered essential workers. So the food system is very, very interesting and important. And with recent changes in the world in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen food systems kind of whipsawed around a fair bit with a lot going on. We know there was obviously the pandemic, and that had huge implications for the food system. The Russian invasion of Ukraine had more implications for the global food system. And now the latest, chapter in this is the sort of trade wars that we're experiencing, where Canada is kind of on the front lines here with the US imposing tariffs. And so I was delighted when David asked me to, and Barb, thank you for the invitation, asked me to speak about geopolitics, because this is, it's not the focus of my most recent book, which is more about corporate concentration, but it's the work that I'm moving into right now on another book project. So I'm really happy to be talking about it today. Okay, so what I want to do is try to help make sense of some of these big changes in the world and how and why they matter for food systems. So if this will work. Yes, I usually focus my talks around questions, because I like to say we're going to ask these big questions, and then through the talk I want to try to answer them. There won't be a quiz at the end, don't worry about it. The first question is just simply, what is the state of food security in the world today? And I think this is important for us to kind of go over some of the basics about hunger, where it is in the world, so that we're all kind of at the same spot when we understand then, okay, so how is that then affected by changes in geopolitics, which is the second question. How is geopolitics and these changing dynamics, how does this matter for outcomes in food systems and food security in particular? And then the third question is, because I like to study politics and policy, the third question is usually, what kind of policy responses do we need? What have states and others have been doing thus far in response to these big changes, and what other action might be necessary to address? And together, hopefully, this will help us to understand how we can navigate this new geopolitics of food. So this first question then, what is the state of food security in the world today? And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the food price inflation we've been having over recent years. How many of you have been quite startled by the cost of groceries in recent years? Yeah, exactly. And this graphic here shows us the map of the world showing food price inflation in June 2023. So it's a couple years old, but this was at the height of the food price inflation. And you see certain parts of the world were experiencing food price inflation more than others. But in general, most parts of the world for which we had the data, we did see rising food prices. And this matters for food security around the world, because when prices rise, it means people have less ability to access food, right? So what do we mean by food security? I've been involved in work that's been trying to define and redefine what we mean by food security, but basically there's 6 elements to it. First, there needs to be enough food in the world and in a community. People need to have access to it, and that access should be on a regular basis. And it should be nutritious, sustainable, and culturally appropriate. In other words, what people want to eat. That's usually, these 6 elements are usually what we consider to be food security. And this food security has been deeply affected by these changes in food systems. And inflation is just one part of that, but we'll talk about some others. But I wanted to point out that this most recent episode of food price inflation was actually the third, what we would call worldwide multi-year food crises in the last 50 years. The first one that people usually talk about in the post-war era is the crisis that happened in the 1970s. How many of you remember the 1970s food crisis? Yeah, I was a kid then, but I remember this was when oil prices were rising quickly. Food prices doubled, tripled, quadrupled in a very short period of time. And then we had a long period where food prices kind of went down. There was kind of overproduction. There was low food commodity prices. But then in 2008 to 2012, we had a period of very rapid price increases in food. I'm sure all of you remember this. It coincided with a financial crisis, oil crisis as well. And then really not too far beyond that, we had this, yet another episode of major worldwide food price inflation that happened beginning around, I would say it was probably June, July, August, after the COVID-19 pandemic really came on the scene. And we started to see disrupted supply chains, higher food prices, and then things kind of got a bit out of control, right? And so you can see there that the peak of the food price crisis around 2020 to 2023 was quite significant when we compare it with recent and in the past. But what's been really troubling policymakers at the international level has been the fact that during this most recent period, like you would expect with this food price inflation, that we might stall on the goals of reducing world hunger. So you might know about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set in 2015, and the idea is that we're going to meet these Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030. But and the second goal is to end hunger. That's written right in SDG number 2, to end hunger and support sustainable food systems. But we've seen serious backsliding on the ability to meet that goal. In fact, there's no way we're going to meet that goal. And in fact, we went backwards. And there was this expectation that maybe this was just a quick peak in inflation and then things would go back to normal and we'd continue on to achieve food security. But it actually didn't quite happen that way. So I want to show you the figures from the UN about what's going on in the world. So maybe it's a bit hard to read, but this orange here is the prevalence of undernourishment. That's the percentage of people that are facing undernourishment in the world. And the blue line, or whatever color that is, dark gray, is the number of people. But you can see here, first of all, you can see there's this jump after 2020. And so what we know in terms of this data from the most recent report is close to 700 million people in the world are chronically undernourished. That's around 8% of the world's population. And what the UN means here by this particular statistic is chronic undernourishment is not getting a sufficient diet for a sedentary lifestyle. That's important, sedentary, continuously for over a year. That's chronic undernourishment. There's 700 million people in the world not getting enough even to just sit around, okay, and not do anything. But imagine you were working, living in a developing country, being a farmer. This is not great. And when we look at moderate or severe food insecurity in the world, this is where we see 2.3 billion people are in this category of moderate or severe food insecurity. And importantly, that's over 300 million more people than was the case in 2019, before the pandemic. We also know that 2.6 billion people in the world cannot afford a healthy diet. The UN did a big study, that was the year before last year, on the ability to afford a healthy diet, and this was the number that they came up with, so it's quite a few people. And at the same time, we've got this huge inequality. Over 2 billion people in the world are overnourished, meaning they're eating more than they would need to maintain a healthy life. And over 2 billion people also suffer from one or more forms of micronutrient deficiency. That means they're lacking vitamins and minerals like iron and potassium, et cetera. So it is a grim situation when we sort of look at these raw numbers and see, these sobering statistics. It's clear that a large percentage of humanity is facing some form of health difficulty related to food. So it's very important that we understand this situation. And I just wanted to show you, I just took a screenshot of this website a couple days ago. This is the World Food Program's hunger map. And the World Food Program, if you're not familiar, there's so many organizations, it's hard to know what they all do. But the Food and Agriculture Organization works on helping with agricultural production. The World Food Program focuses on providing food assistance for people in situations where it's complex emergencies. And their hunger map shows here, the regions of the world that are facing the most severe hunger. And so you can see, obviously, we can see in parts of Africa and parts of Asia, there's severe hunger, and more moderate in the orange. Much of India is actually in that category. And in the green, it's the less severe food insecurity. So in Canada, we can say, okay, it doesn't look that bad in Canada compared to some other parts of the world, but we shouldn't be complacent. A report just came out recently showing that throughout this period that I'm talking about, the last 5 years, the number of people in Canada who live in a household that is food insecure has actually risen quite substantially. It's now around a quarter of all Canadians live in a household that is food insecure. Now, the definition of food insecurity from the Canadian perspective is a little bit different from that chronic undernourishment that I was talking about, obviously, but it's still hunger. It's still people's perceived deprivation of food, and the fact that they're holding back in terms of when they eat, how much they eat, and shifting their diet from things that might be healthier to things that are more affordable but might not be as healthy. So we have this hunger problem. It's pretty much everywhere, but it is more severe in some parts of the world than others. And if I can get that to move. And so I just wanted to show you some more of the statistics from this report because I think it's really interesting. But we see that the part of the world, you could see where it was red on the map in sub-Saharan Africa, this is where we've actually seen a lot of the backsliding in terms of not meeting the SDGs. In terms of SDG number 2, we're actually seeing an increase in the number of people facing hunger in Africa, whereas in other parts of the world, like Asia, Latin America, it's a little bit more mixed. We saw increases initially with the pandemic and with the war in Ukraine affecting global supply chains, but then we've seen some progress. So it's hard to say overall hunger is increasing everywhere. It's a complicated picture. It's not straightforward. And there are some success stories. So I don't know if you might have seen this in the media this summer, but really exciting for Brazil. I have colleagues in Brazil who are very excited that Brazil finally made it off the UN's hunger map. Because it had such success in addressing hunger through really progressive policies, where they had procurement policies and policies supporting ecological agriculture and policies feeding children in schools. They were able to tackle hunger. So that's the sort of whirlwind tour of the situation of hunger in the world today. And now I want to shift to talk about geopolitics. And this is probably where most of my comments will be tonight. And it's a big, huge topic, but I'm going to sort of try to narrow it down a little bit. But I just want to say at the outset that thinking about geopolitics, what I'm really referring to are these big tectonic shifts in global politics and in the global economy that tend to bring in new eras in which norms change and norms shift. So if you think about it in the way that obviously there was the Second World War, and that, when that ended, we had the Cold War. That was a certain kind of world order. Then the Cold War ended, and we saw the rise of sort of a neoliberal economy. And then that world is kind of over now, and we're kind of shifting back into a different world in terms of this new geopolitics. But what's interesting about each of these eras is at the beginning, there's just a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. And it's usually not until like a decade later that we can look back and see what happened and understand, and then a new normal kind of appears. But at this moment, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, which makes it both challenging to research, but also interesting and exciting because we're trying to make sense of the big changes in the world. So that's what I want to talk about. And I'm just going to give a little snapshot of the topics I'm going to cover in the next couple minutes. The way that I'm going to divide talking about this new geopolitics of food, I'm going to talk about military conflict and how that's affecting food security. I'm going to talk about the economic trade wars and a bit of chaos there with cuts to aid and et cetera. And I see those first two as kind of triggers to this new geopolitical order that we're moving into. And they're being complicated by two underlying factors, two trends that were already there, and they're still there, and they're making the new geopolitics even more complex. And that's market concentration in the food system, as well as climate change. So when you think about all of these things happening at once, and I know it gets a bit overwhelming and a little bit, both overwhelming and depressing to talk about all this stuff at once, but I'm going to talk about each one separately, but you'll start to see the interconnections and how they all interact with one another to create situations in which we have outcomes in the food system that are problematic, especially for food insecurity. So, oh yeah, now it works. Okay. All right. So first, we're going to talk about military conflict. And the obvious, well, first of all, just to say, we seem to have an uptick in military conflicts in the world. I'm sure you're aware of this, reading the news. And it just seems more and more like these conflicts are very, very present in the world, but they have important implications for food security that we need to pay attention to. The most obvious recent case that had worldwide implications was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, and the war is still continuing now. But it was in the early months and the first year of that conflict that had huge ramifications in food supply chains. They've kind of, supply chains kind of figured out new routes of trade and new modes of operation, that it's less inflated than it was at the beginning, but still food prices are pretty high as a result. But I want to talk about how and why this conflict was so important for global food security. Like, why were Africans facing higher food prices because of a war in Ukraine? Well, it's important to understand that there was a huge proportion of the world's staple crops were actually grown in both Ukraine and Russia. So just to give you the statistics, 25% of the world's wheat is being produced by Russia and or Ukraine. And Russia and Ukraine together also produce 20% of the world's barley exports, 15% of the world's maize exports, 10% of the world's sunflower seeds, and et cetera. So together, Russia and Ukraine are very important in terms of the global market for these important crops, oilseeds and basic staples. And some countries have become very reliant on buying grain from this part of the world. So as you can see on the map here in this diagram, Egypt was one of the biggest buyers of wheat from Russia and Ukraine, but other countries as well. Indonesia was a big purchaser, Nigeria, et cetera. And so when this conflict happened, supply chains were immediately disrupted. Prices went up, and I'll explain in a little bit some of the other mechanisms that caused prices to go up because of this conflict. But it led to higher prices in it might seem far-flung parts of the world, but they were market purchasers of these products that were being sold on global markets. And the reason this disruption became very severe, Russia was actually targeting Odessa, which is the main port that Ukraine exports its grain out of, and they were targeting the grain silos, they were targeting the grain ships. We had to have the Black Sea grain deal that the UN negotiated so that we could get safe passage of the grain out, because it was causing this worldwide food crisis. So, and this was after the COVID-19 pandemic also led to these kind of increased food prices. So it was not a great time if you were reliant on wheat coming from this part of the world. And I found a really interesting graphic in a research article that I assigned my students, actually, and I was like, oh, hey, I have to show this in this talk, because it's really, it may be hard to read because it doesn't translate very well, but I'll just tell you, it's showing the countries of the world importing wheat from Russia and Ukraine and the extent of their dependency. So you can see here, for example, Libya was quite important. Oh, I guess I could use this laser pointer now that the AV guy told me. Yeah. So Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Yemen, like all these countries were actually so reliant on these two exporters for almost all of their wheat. And so it makes sense. The crisis really spread quickly to many countries around the world. And this was just a really stark example of how military conflict can have profound implications. And we saw this through the rise in food prices, which I mentioned already, but you can see here, this is the price for wheat here, and you can see later in the year in 2022, there was a huge spike in wheat prices, and it stayed high until around the time of the UN Black Sea grain deal, and also traders figured out, other routes and et cetera, and also fertilizer, increasing the price of producing food, because Russia and Belarus are both also big producers of fertilizer and exporters of fertilizer, and those supply chains were also disrupted. So you can see here there is a huge spike in fertilizer prices happening at the same time, and that pushed up prices all over the world because these are worldwide traded commodities, this fertilizer. And so that led to higher food prices. And obviously when prices go up, people have less access. They're either, as I said already, they're either eating less or switching to less healthy foods. And so this, I just wanted to give this example of this particular conflict because it was so important on a worldwide scale. But we also have to remember that conflicts are happening in many, many parts of the world. And it's not surprising that when you look at this, World Food Program puts out this hunger hotspots report every quarter or so, and it shows us that the countries most impacted by food insecurity are also facing conflict. So there's conflict in Sudan, there's conflict in South Sudan, there's conflict in Palestine and Gaza, there's conflict in Myanmar and Mali. All these places are experiencing conflict and also food insecurity at the same time. So we have this situation where you have these wars causing worldwide consequences, and then these regional and local wars also causing consequences. And the reason these conflicts are so devastating for people's food insecurity is simply the fact that life is completely disrupted. People are displaced. They lose their livelihoods. They often end up in refugee camps. They don't have any means to acquire food, and they have to rely on food assistance. And on and on. The UN is facing budget shortages. The World Food Program has to reduce its rations, and so on. It becomes a very, very difficult situation. And we know that in September, for example, or in August, I guess it was, the IPC, the organization that declares famine, pointed out that both Sudan and Gaza were in famine situation. And in both cases, around 2 million people are affected by these famine situations. So conflict, obviously extremely important. Okay, now I'm gonna move on to the trade wars. Just to add to it, yeah. So here we see Trump. This was a picture taken on that Liberation Day, April 2nd, when he announced his reciprocal tariffs on the whole world, including islands that were uninhabited, where he, decided to put tariffs on everybody. But this move of the U.S. to, follow along with Trump's favorite word, which is tariffs, he apparently said, it led to a situation where the U.S. went from an effective tariff rate of about 2 or 3% up to, at that moment, it went up to over 20. It's now back down to around 17. I think that's the average effective tariff rate in the US right now. But it was quite a remarkable shift. We haven't seen tariffs that high in the US for, decades. Not decades, like a century almost. And so this has huge implications, including for food systems. And obviously, I'm sure, you've talked about this with each other, I'm sure, about the extent to which this trade war has led to many people wanting to buy less food or no food coming from the US. I just want to get a show of hands. How many of you changed your buying habits as a result of the trade war when it comes to food? All right, many, many people. Do you follow the signs in the supermarket that tell you what's prepared in Canada? Yeah, so it became like a trade conflict is different from a military conflict, but it still affects us on a really emotional level. And many people wanted to reduce Canada's reliance on American markets because of the way we were being treated, being, called by Trump the 51st state, upsetting very, very many people. And that was one way that people felt in their daily lives that they could take action by buying Canadian. But of course, I'm sure you heard about some supermarkets maple washing, and so I don't know, how many of you started to do greater due diligence when you research what you shop? Yeah. Yes, but there comes a point at which it gets hard if you're working full-time or whatever to do that. But it's important for us to understand what we're eating, where it's coming from. But Canada's also caught in the crossfire of other kinds of trade tensions and disputes. So I'm sure you're aware of the fact that, even before Trump came to power, the US asked Canada to put tariffs on electric vehicles coming from China because there was this feeling that they were maybe going to be dumping those vehicles on us and harming our auto industry. And China responded with tariffs on Canada, and in particular on canola. So I wrote down what they were. They placed a 75% anti-dumping fee on Canada's canola, as well as 100% tariffs on Canadian canola oil and meal. So we're not selling a lot of canola to China right now. And China was a particularly important market for us because they were really interested in the canola as animal feed, as vegetable oil, et cetera. And so we kind of lost those markets. And when you look at this graphic here that shows us that, now I got this laser pointer, I don't want to stop using it. But we see here that China and the US are our biggest trading partners in the food system. And especially the US. If you think about it, the Canadian food system is so entangled with the US food system, they're almost indistinguishable. We get so many fruits and vegetables from the US, but also, we not only export our wheat to Canada, or to the US, but we import baked goods from the US. Like, it's kind of weird, right? So people are like, maybe we should be producing these foods ourselves with our own production. We apparently grow a lot of mustard seed, but we don't have local mustard production. We have to send it to the US for processing and import it back. And so it's a complicated picture, but Canada is in the middle of this crossfire. But Canada is, of course, our point of reference because here we are in Canada talking about it, but there's other dynamics going on in the trade war that's really interesting. First off, just to point out that China has shifted its soy imports from the US to now buying it from Brazil. And this is a really important and interesting dynamic because it's very politically problematic in the US right now, because the US used to be the world's largest exporter of soy. In the last decade or so, Brazil has taken over the US now as the biggest exporter of soy. China used to buy from the US, but with the first trade war with Trump at 2018, they got used to the idea of buying from Brazil instead. And now with the new trade war, China's basically like, no, thank you. We're not going to buy soy from the US at all. And so this dramatic, it's down. This is a New York Times headline from just last month showing it's now zero. So that's quite a significant shift in this relationship between the US, Brazil, and China, this kind of triangle. But it's interesting because it also highlights other issues going on within the US, because many US farmers are really annoyed, especially if they're soybean farmers. They're super annoyed because they lost these markets that took them decades to build. But at the same time, their cost of production is going up. I mentioned already that, here around 2022, fertilizer prices went up. But if you can see here, sorry, it's hard to read, but potash imports, production prices are also going up in the US. And that's because, if I have on this graphic here, the US doesn't produce potash. Who produces potash? Canada. Right. So the US imports 97% of its potash, and 85% of that comes from Canada. And the US put a 10% tariff on potash. It's a bit lower. They did 10% on energy and 10% on potash, because they're such important resources for the US. But this slightly lower tariff wasn't enough for those farmers, the soybean farmers in the US. You can look here, crop prices of soy and maize, et cetera, and wheat have fallen through the floor in the US. So this is what we call in sort of economic speak a cost price squeeze. Basically, the cost of production is going up and the price that the farmers are able to sell for is going down. And so this is really harming their livelihoods. And it's this, if I just sort of ad-lib in here, the point about the US providing currency assistance to Argentina. Argentina is another producer of soy, And here we have the US government's propping up the currency in Argentina, and the farmers in the US are livid because it's basically giving money to Argentina, and that's a country they see as a competitor for selling soy. So it's leading to all kinds of strange outcomes. And politically, I think it was just yesterday that Trump posted some social media post basically saying that farmers were idiots, which was not really what he should have done. But he was saying they're complaining in a way that they shouldn't be. Okay. So I'm going to move on from the trade wars to talk about some of these underlying forces that are making the hot wars and the trade wars, the military wars and the trade wars more complicated. And the first one I want to talk about is this problem of market concentration. So there's huge market concentration all across food systems, and in you can look at it from many different angles and many different ways and see that concentration. One way is to look at who's exporting these products that are being traded around the world. And it's relatively few countries that are actually dominating the export of the staple grains. So on the big diagram here, when we talk about world wheat exports, I pulled this from the USDA's website and made this graphic to show that 7 countries control over 80% of the world's wheat exports. So if you think about it, if anything happens to any one of those countries, or in the case of the Russia-Ukraine situation, 2 countries, it's going to cause major ructions on the markets because of that high level of concentration. And when we look at soybean exports in this graphic here, you see it's just Brazil and the US dominate almost the entire market. So if we have drought in Brazil or in the parts of the US that are growing these crops, it can have major implications for the way these markets play out. And so that's an important aspect to think about, is the number of countries. And this is true for maize, it's true for wheat, it's true for rice. These markets are all dominated, the export markets anyway, dominated by just a few countries. And then when you add to that the fact that we have concentrated diets as well. So I find these data really striking. Just 3 grains, just 3 of them, the wheat, the rice, and the maize, those 3, account for almost half of human diets on a global scale. And 86% of the world's cereal markets are these 3 crops, okay? So that's pretty concentrated in terms of what we're buying and selling and what we're eating. And when you add soy into the mix, this one here, that's constituting around 2/3 of human diets. So just these 4 are basically the bulk of what most people eat on a regular basis. And so this concentration, if you add that concentration of what we eat to the concentration of who's exporting it, you start to see that when something happens, it's like what is that fairy tale, The Princess and the Pea? Yeah. But it really expands. So it could be a relatively small disruption that could lead to these global reverberation. What's the word I'm trying to say? Reverberations, yeah. Okay, but I want to also say it's not just that. There's also market concentration in terms of the firms that control different parts of the food system. So when we look at the global seed market, for example, just 6 companies control around 58% of the market. Agrochemicals, around 6 firms control 78% of the market. Fertilizer, this is less concentrated, but around 10 firms control 38%. But in Canada, it's like 2 firms control almost everything. Farm machinery, we've got top 5 or 6 firms controlling 50%. Grain trade, 5 firms around 70%. Bananas, 5 firms, 75%. Beer, that's another, surprisingly concentrated. 5 firms controlling almost 60% of the world market. Carbonated soft drinks, 2 firms, 65% of the market. Guess what are those 2 firms? I wonder. And then the food retail, we know that in Canada, 5 firms control 76% of the market. And why is this important? It's important because economists say when the top 4 firms in particular, if they control more than 40% of the market, you can get price distortions in the marketplace. And because it tamps down competition and it gives those firms the space to raise prices further. That's called market power. So we've got these different kinds of market concentration operating in the system. And it's not just these are global figures that I've given you here pretty much, but if you look around the world, with my graduate student and colleagues, we pulled all these data that we could find from different parts of the world, in Asia, Latin America, and specific countries, like even in South Africa and Ethiopia. We see pretty considerable concentration in food markets that reaches or exceeds that 40% threshold. So we have a very concentrated food system. It's not it's not every part of the food system, but enough that it's concerning, especially when it's at retail and especially when it's at production. So these are these underlying factors. So it maybe gives a clue that when a military conflict disrupts the supply chain, this is going to play through in complicated ways that concentration might make more pronounced. It might make it harder for people, especially because there's been concern, and I'm sure you heard about this in the Canada case. How many of you remember when they brought all the grocery CEOs to parliamentary hearings to grill them about whether they were raising prices? The question there was, are you raising your prices more than your own costs are going up? And they were like, no, we weren't doing that. But research around the world shows that in some cases, they were doing that. In fact, when Kroger and Albertsons in the US, these are two supermarkets that were trying to merge, the merger didn't happen in the end, but Kroger actually admitted that they were raising prices higher than their own costs were rising. This also happened in the fertilizer sector. Nutrien, which, is based here, but in its here in Canada, but in its annual report to its shareholders, it said they were able to raise prices more than their own costs. And this was seen as a good thing, right? Because it increased the share value of the company. But this is it's a touchy situation. It's one of these things that's typically hard to prove. But when the companies admit it themselves, you think, well, okay, maybe this is going on to some extent. But some research has shown that there has been some tendency, when there's market power present, of firms to take advantage of uncertain and volatile situations to raise prices beyond what would normally be the case in competitive markets. And that's just the exercise of market power. So that's something that's been concerning. And also, sorry to keep it, there's always one more thing, but we also have in the food system what we call a financialized situation where how many of you have heard of like commodity funds that you can invest in as an investor, maybe for your retirement savings or whatever, right? And you might often hear from a financial advisor, it's good to diversify your portfolio. You don't want to just hold stocks. You don't want to just hold JSEs. Maybe you want to hold some commodities because they're a hedge against inflation. This happened to a lot of people. A lot of people moved into investing in these kinds of products, and in part because, first of all, there was a paper published about 20 years ago that showed that commodities were a good hedge against inflation. And then everybody started to invest in them, and the banking regulations became relaxed, and all of a sudden banks were allowed to offer these products that were tracking the price of commodities, like wheat. I mean, we've had wheat futures markets going back to the 1800s, but now it's easy for anyone to, you used to have to go to the pit, or go to the commodity exchange and be involved, but now you can just go to your bank and buy a product. And we saw this when Russia invaded Ukraine. I just wanted to highlight here, that's exactly what happened there. Prices shot up on wheat futures almost overnight. Just radical increase in prices, and that was shown by investigative journalists to be the result of increased financial investment in commodity futures. And when the Black Sea grain deal was finally negotiated, those investors all then got rid of their investments and the price came back down. So we can't underestimate the role that financial investment plays in making these markets more volatile. Okay, this is the last big category. I know it's getting from depressing to even more depressing, but we're going to talk a little bit about climate change. And climate change obviously is really important, and these geopolitical shifts are happening in a world that is warming. We know climate change is happening, and it has huge implications for agriculture. It has implications because agriculture depends on the weather, right? This is what farmers' almanacs were all about, trying to predict the weather. But we know now with climate change, we're seeing more rain, we're seeing more drought, we're seeing more storms. As Canada, we know, we're seeing more fires, and we're seeing obviously warmer temperatures. the issue is that it's hard to know exactly when these catastrophic weather and climate-related events are actually going to happen, where exactly they're going to happen, and how they're going to impact food and agriculture. So there's a huge degree of uncertainty that's entered into this system. I mean, just to give an example of how climate can exacerbate a situation, after the wheat prices went up when Russia invaded Ukraine, a few months later, India had a major heat event. I don't know how many of you remember that. India lost a quarter of its wheat harvest due to that major heat event, and that only, made the situation worse because we already had these disrupted supply chains, and India is a big producer of wheat. And so this situation has, climate change has made everything kind of more complicated. I just want to give the example of rice. This is really, really important because we know that many people in the world, I think it's over half the world's population depends on rice as their staple crop. They eat it almost every day. 90% of the world's rice is produced in Asia, and research has shown that the increase in nighttime temperatures due to climate change actually reduces the yield of rice. So every 1 degree increase in the nighttime temperature, and how many of you have been upset about increased nighttime temperatures? I know I have. I don't like to turn on the air conditioner, but it's hard when it's 21 degrees at night, right? But this is happening in Asia, and for every 1 degree increase in nighttime temperatures, it results in a 10% drop in the yields of rice. So this is quite dramatic, and scientists are working really hard to come up with ways to breed new kinds of rice that can withstand these higher temperatures. But it's really a really important issue, of course. And we know, the World Food Program, which does wonderful work, especially I love their visualizations, but they show here what they call their index of the food insecurity and climate change index. And it's measuring exposure to climate-related hazards, sensitivity to national agricultural production and climate-related hazards, and adaptive capacity to climate change. And it shows, and you might guess these are the parts of the world, but some people say, well, Canada might benefit from climate change because now we can have more agricultural production in the northern part of the country, but it is also happening at the same time that parts of the world like sub-Saharan Africa are seeing some of the most severe implications. And this isn't the future. They say right here, this is the present day. So this is the vulnerability, and these are the countries that overlap with the countries facing inflation. These are the countries facing conflict, and these are the countries facing climate. And I wanted to, this is an animated video or visual, so I'm going to show you the next one. This is in 2050. This is their prediction. So it's getting worse. And this is 2080. So it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And they only show the countries for which they had this data. So that doesn't include Europe and North America, Australia. But we see among the developing world quite a stark pattern of increased vulnerability to climate change in some of the poorest parts of the world. And also we know there's a study that was just published this summer. You might have seen it in the paper. It was all over the news. I picked The Guardian here for the headline, but that researchers are tying climate events to actual food price inflation. There's a direct relationship here. We see, obviously, in this diagram, you probably can't read it, but it's Australia had an episode in June 2022 that affected lettuce. Ghana had an episode in 2024 affecting cocoa, et cetera. It goes on down the list. And you might have noticed some of these. I mean, one is the cocoa example, and I looked it up to see what that event was. The event was that in 2024, there were an additional 6 weeks of temperature over 32 degrees that affected the cocoa growing regions in West Africa, and prices went up by a factor of 4. How many of you have noticed that chocolate prices have gone up? Exactly, because there's more cocoa in a dark chocolate bar. But companies are trying to add more sugar and other ingredients so that you don't notice. And also there was a drought in Brazil, and look what happened to coffee prices. They shot right up, and that was also last year. How many of you noticed coffee prices are crazy high? Yeah, exactly. So I mean, these are the kinds of things that might affect us. Maybe you have a piece of chocolate after dinner, like I do, and I notice it's more expensive, or I like to have a cup of coffee in the morning. But for some countries, these kind of climate change-driven inflation is affecting food staples. It's affecting the foods that people need. You know, I can do without coffee and I can do without chocolate, but I don't think I could do without bread. And so this is quite concerning, that climate change is leading to this kind of food price inflation. And I just wanted to stress as well, we have to understand that our diet matters. A third of climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions, actually come from the food system itself. So it's kind of this reinforcing system where a third of climate emissions are coming from the agriculture sector, and then climate change is affecting agricultural production, right? And you can see here, there's this really cool website called Our World in Data, and you can actually put in your own diet, and it will tell you what your climate footprint is if you're interested to look. But this is the standard one that they show, and it shows obviously beef and dairy are pretty high up on the list in terms of their climate impacts. So, some people are choosing to eat less climate damaging foods like eating vegetarian, et cetera. Okay, one more depressing thing to say, just about how these interconnections are happening. And there's a lot of concern also in the environmental policy community that as China has decided not to buy US soy, it's buying Brazilian soy, but that's increasing deforestation in Brazil as that soy is expanding. And that deforestation it's concerning because it can lead to us achieving these tipping points more quickly, beyond which there will be irreversible damage from climate change. So there's just a lot going on in terms of the way these things connect with one another. So just to come back to my little handy diagram here, to sum up what I've been talking about, is these four things, like these two big tectonic shifts in geopolitics and these underlying conditions, have led to a range of consequences. It's disrupted supply chains, it's led to higher food prices, it's led to climbing import bills, especially for developing countries, it's elevated corporate profit, it's led to ecological costs, and of course it's increasing hunger and inequality. And it's hard to draw the straight line from any one of those to any one outcome because they're interacting in such complex ways. And so it's hard to make sense of it. So that's why I'm trying to put this together so that we can see what the consequences are of these complicated relationships. Okay, this is my last, I don't know how long I've been speaking for, David. Am I okay? I better stop soon. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about the kinds of policy responses we've seen thus far and the kind of action that we might need going forward. And this is actually a diagram I put together with one of my graduate students, and it shows the self-sufficiency ratios of different countries in the world. And this is simply for cereals, like how self-sufficient are countries in terms of their staples. The staples usually cereals, rice, wheat, et cetera. And it shows that the countries in blue are doing pretty well, right? So Canada's doing pretty well. Even in the green, countries are producing more than they consume. But once you start to get into the orange and the red, these are countries that are producing less food than they consume. So what it means is that these countries have to buy food on international markets if they want to ensure their population can achieve food security. But it's difficult. Many of these countries have lower GDP. Many of them are highly indebted. It's a tricky situation. And then you get these like geopolitical shifts, higher food prices. It just creates all kinds of uncertainty and difficulty for those countries. So it shouldn't be surprising that we're seeing a number of countries looking at this kind of data and information and saying, we want to be more self-sufficient. And unfortunately, it would take like 3 more lectures to explain why these countries are not food self-sufficient right now, but just take my word for it, it's complicated. Goes back to colonial history and, et cetera. But it shouldn't be surprising that we're seeing a number of countries making statements saying, we're going to boost our own food production because we don't want to buy on international markets anymore. It's not secure. They've lost trust in these kinds of markets. And so countries as diverse as, well, we've seen India pushing for this policy, we've seen Ethiopia, we've seen Nigeria, we've even seen Canada making these kind of comments. In Europe, they're making these comments. All around the world, there's this desire for greater self-sufficiency. And this to me is super interesting because for most of my career, pushing food self-sufficiency was like seen as a no-no. It was criticized by economists because it's not efficient. But when you put politics into the picture, maybe efficiency isn't the only thing that we should be looking at. And that's what countries are turning to look at this. So I want to just say, whoops, everything came up at once. I don't know why that happened. So this loss of trust in the markets, as I said, is spurring these kinds of responses. One of them is just to boost domestic production. But that's not easy because it's also this question of, well, how are we going to do that? And there's really interesting discussions going on. We've been tracking, different countries' policy responses, and the discourses, are kind of split. Some countries want to go all in on industrial agriculture to increase their production. Others want to do it more ecologically. And it's not really clear yet how this is going to shake out, but you might have heard of, maybe you're going to have a talk on digital agriculture, the rise of AI in agriculture, maybe, or maybe someone else will bring it up. But this is a kind of model that some countries are talking about, but others are very much opposed to it. So that will be interesting to see how that comes out. Other countries are trying to diversify their trade partners. In other words, and we're seeing this, right? China's diversifying its partners, moving away from the US, moving towards Brazil. But this also raises concerns for countries because they don't want to become dependent on other countries. And, you could just be switching from one unreliable partner to another one. And also they have certain, buyers, countries as buyers. They don't want to become too reliant. So diversity is important, but again, it's not clear exactly how that's going to play out. And we're seeing countries also taking greater measures to protect their producers. Canada protects its producers through supply management, for example, in the dairy and the poultry and eggs, et cetera. And other countries are doing similar kinds of things, trying to protect them through public stockholding programs that maybe provide food. India does this. It provides it provides a market that sells grain at lower prices for people who are food insecure. And so we're seeing more and more of this kind of stuff. But these measures, they're obviously expensive, and powerful states are seeking to prevent others from using them. I mean, Canada is on the front line of this, right? Our supply management system is under direct threat. The US wants to get rid of it. They're also doing the same thing to India. They're trying to pry open India's dairy market. They're trying to stop India from its stockholding. So these kind of things can become bargaining chips in these geopolitical conflicts. So I don't have the answer of how this is going to turn out. This is just what we're seeing in terms of what states are doing. And my last slide, I'm going to blue sky some of my ideas because I was invited last week to present to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, who was asking for advice from academics and others in the nonprofit sector about how Canada can meet its climate commitments while also not losing its trade markets in agriculture. But the idea that I had already been working on is something that I call cooperative self-reliance. And what I mean by this is that we should not necessarily tell states you shouldn't try to be self-reliant. You're not going to stop them from wanting to be self-reliant, but maybe we can achieve self-reliance in a way where we cooperate with each other. In other words, states can help each other to be more self-reliant and create more trusting trade partnerships with each other when they share ideals. So this would mean working cooperatively with like-minded countries or communities to foster greater resilience and self-reliant strategies. It could mean collaborating across borders around supporting ecological and climate-friendly forms of agriculture to boost domestic production. It can mean supporting infrastructures for what we call territorial markets. This is kind of, I'm sure you shop at the local farmers market. That's a territorial market. It's a market grounded and rooted in territory. But it doesn't just have to be at the local level. It can be at the regional level or the national level as well. And this is something Canada is really interested in doing, is supporting infrastructure for more local food production, and then fostering fair and cooperative international trade relationships built on solidarity principles. So this is my idea of what I think we need to do. But getting there, this is something I'm still working on. So I was happy to be able to present about it, and interested to hear your reactions. So with that, I'll just say thank you. David mentioned my book. That's my new book. And these are some of the other things I've published in the past. And I'm sorry, David, I talked for too long, but I look forward to your questions.
We'll just get the microphone set up and yeah, feel free to fire away.
Yesterday on CBC, they were talking about the fact that we're importing more beef from New Zealand and Australia. And then today on CBC, the Canadian Beef Association was whining about not being able to sell their beef to UK. Why don't we keep it here? Is it because they can sell it for more in the UK or think they can? Thought so.
No, that's a great question. And I mean, that's something that a lot of people ask. And there's this concept that we talk about in food studies called redundant trade, where we're basically exporting apples and importing apples. And I mentioned we're exporting wheat, we're importing wheat. Why don't we keep it at home? I mean, usually the answer, and I don't study the beef sector specifically, but usually the answer is it's some kind of specialty product, perhaps, that has a certain market in a different part of the world. But it's a really great question, because this is something that I think is a challenge for Canada right now, is to retool internal trade within this country so that we can serve our own markets with our own production. And as I mentioned, for years, this was seen as some sort of inefficient way to do things, but not necessarily. If you think about the cost of transportation, the climate implications of transportation and shipping halfway around the world. So this is something that I think we need to get better at. But there's all, of course, we talk about these internal trade barriers between the provinces in Canada. And also there's a big distance between Newfoundland and British Columbia, right? Yes, but at the same time, like I just learned this summer that not only are greenhouses in Canada producing, say, tomatoes and cucumbers for Canadian markets, they're actually selling them to North Carolina. I gave a talk in North Carolina, and they're like, yeah, we eat Canadian cucumbers. And I was like, what? So, like, why aren't we able to service the fruit and vegetable needs we need at home? So I think that's the infrastructure I was talking about for that local trade, that I think it could make a big difference. But anyway, thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for a particularly interesting presentation and a lot of very interesting statistics. One of your slides showed the 3 grains plus soy that made up a multiplicity of human consumption. And I was curious, does that include grains that are fed to animals that we consume?
Thank you for that question. That's human diets that statistic relates to, but it's a really important point that you raised, because the world, I didn't, I wasn't giving the talk of like, why are people hungry when we produce more than enough food in the world, but we do. We produce around the equivalent of around 3,000 calories a day per person in the world. But of the agricultural production we grow, around half of it is going to either biofuels or animal feed, and the other half is going to feed humans. So we're producing a whole lot of agricultural crops, right? But some are going to these industrial uses, some are going to feed animals, some are going to feed humans. But that statistic that you asked about was specifically about human diets. Thanks.
Hi, I've got a ton of questions, so I'm going to try and mash 2 together and see if they fix. If we're trying to bolster food self-reliance in Canada, which is a great goal, how do we balance that with the pressure for more housing and affordable housing, which often threatens agricultural land? And we've seen that here in Northumberland County. Then connected to that, do we have public or private pension funds that are investing in agricultural commodity markets like this, and should they be?
Right. No, it's a great question. I mean, I haven't done the research on the Canadian pension plan funds, whatever, but I'm sure they're investing in agricultural land as well, speculating on land values. I'm sure they're investing in commodities to hedge their, their risks. So I think we should be concerned about that. There were big campaigns in the 2008 to 12 food crisis where activists were showing up at banks and showing up in shareholder meetings and pension meetings, making these kinds of complaints. And it actually did lead to a reduction in that kind of speculation for a while until people stopped looking. But I think that's a good question. But your other question, I think, is also really interesting, is how do we balance this goal against the need for housing? What's interesting to me as someone who's studied finance and financialization in agriculture is this is also going on in housing. Part of the reason housing is so expensive is because financial investors are buying into these real estate investment funds or investment trusts. They're buying into not just, farmland investment, whatever. It's just raised the price of everything. But we're seeing some of the air come out of that bubble a little bit right now with higher interest rates. We're seeing more investors offloading. I was just reading in the Financial Times yesterday, there's a big offloading of real estate right now by these trusts and funds. So this could bring the cost of housing down, but you're absolutely right that the expansion of cities, borders of cities, et cetera, are directly leading to land conversion problems of agricultural land being converted into urban areas. And at the same time, we're seeing forests being taken down in order to expand agriculture. But we're losing something like a couple hundred acres a day in Ontario of farmland to urban expansion. So it's a big, big problem and an issue. And I don't pretend to have the answer, but I do think that Canada, because we already produce way more than we consume, we export so much. We export wheat, we export lentils, we export beef. We could retool the system to serve more the domestic market, but because agriculture is such an important aspect of our overall exports, the government doesn't want to let go of that either. So yeah, sorry, it's complicated.
Jennifer, what makes you feel hopeful about the future?
Thank you, Wendy.
Please.
Thank you. Well, it's funny, people ask me that all the time because I study kind of big, depressing, and intractable problems. But I have to say, I do wake up every day hopeful that the more people understand these dynamics, that we can make change together, that we can work politically towards, through non-governmental organizations or through participation in the political process, that we can change practices. And I was actually probably more hopeful maybe 5 years ago or maybe even 1 year ago. Because I really believe in the power of ideas and the power of norms. But this last year, we've seen so many norms crushed, and so, with big change down south of the border. Yeah. I don't need to say more about that. But it makes changing those ideas a little bit harder because of that political context. But I do believe that we have the capacity to make that change the more we understand the nature of the problem. And I'm a big believer in, I spend a lot of the time on the problems, but if we don't understand the problems, we don't know how to fix them. So, but that's what keeps me hopeful. It's I wake up every day thinking we can articulate this problem better. We can convince more people that we need to make these kind of changes. And hopefully that will lead to change.
I was wondering if you could answer, with the exception of the United States, which is an anomaly in so many ways, I see there's a trend globally that a lot of countries are leaning more towards right-wing or authoritarian governments. Do you see a relationship between the global food economy and this lean towards the right?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've thought about that enough to give a good answer to that question. But these are definitely problems that are happening at the same time. We're seeing that move towards the right in many countries. We're seeing, these patterns of concentration, maybe the politicians on the right less concerned about climate change. I can see how this can, complicate the story that I've been telling, but I'm not sure that I could say that the turn to the right is making this direct implication. But now I will think about that question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. It was a great talk. I wonder whether you thought about water in terms of an issue for the whole food production thing, because water is going to become increasingly more important for everybody. So that's my question.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I focus mostly on climate change, but in my work, I'm really interested in how food systems are affecting biodiversity and how they're affecting water use. And as we're seeing this, and they're all connected, by the way, this sort of water, food, energy, definitely connected, biodiversity, et cetera. And as we're seeing this kind of land conversion change and increasingly the adoption of industrial forms of agriculture, I think these can be quite concerning. And it's water not just in terms of how much water we use or need for agriculture, but it is one of the bigger users of water. It's also, we need to protect water from runoff from agrochemicals. And not to get off on another tangent, but like we're in a situation right now, yeah, you get to hear it first here. No, like it'll become more and more in the news. They're discovering now that many of the pesticides that are used in agriculture are actually contaminated with the PFAS, the forever chemicals. And they're actually leaching from the containers that the pesticides are kept in, and then they're sprayed on the crops. They get taken up into the plants, and then we end up eating them. And the companies that produce these chemicals are quite concerned about the liabilities from this. But anyway, I think it's not just the water we use, but also we need to protect the water and its safety, because water is life, definitely. But thank you for that question.
He just asked my question, but I'm going to add to the water thing. Water is the one thing that we don't put a cost on, and that may be a big problem.
Yes, but I would say water is priceless, and there's a huge debate about whether we should put a price on water. And in many places where water's been privatized, it's also then less accessible to those who are the poorest. So there's all kinds of minefields around this issue. And I think, if we as humans can collectively decide some goods are public goods and we want to protect them, and we need to protect them, maybe that's the route. But yeah, it's a good question.
My question is about Canada specifically, and if we see our potential, cash crops and things losing their potential markets, where does Canada go in terms of pivoting, and what opportunities are there for Canadian farmers to either find new markets or change the kind of agriculture that they do?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question. In fact, today in my class, just before I came here, I was teaching my food politics class, and the focus was trade this week. And so what I created 15 little strips of paper, and they had to draw them out of a hat, and everybody got a different commodity. So each group got a different commodity. So some were doing wheat, and some were doing dairy, et cetera. And I asked them to figure out, are we importing or exporting? What are the major issues here, and what would you advise the government of Canada to do? And so it's really interesting, because I gave them like a good half an hour to research the issue. But what was really striking to me was the range of things that we do export, and well, in some cases import, but how specific each one is, in terms of like the markets. So for example, India is our biggest market for lentils. But India has declared they want to be self-sufficient in lentils, and they have a tariff on their lentils. So should Canada try to convince India to keep buying lentils from us, or should we find other markets for those lentils? Or, as you're saying, should farmers maybe switch crops to something else? Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think different producers are going to figure out what they need to do as the market shifts like that. But there might be a market for alternative, like meat alternatives that use these protein, because lentils are protein and we need proteins in our diets. So, and Canada's a really good place to grow lentils, and it's a good place to grow wheat, and it's the kind of wheat that you need for pasta. And of course, Italy likes to buy our pasta, but they don't like that we might spray it with glyphosate, you know, and so like there's all this complicated relationships going on. But in terms of, but this is what I was saying when I was meeting with the, you know, AAFC people, is simply that we have to recognize we're in a new geopolitical order. We can't assume that markets that were there once will be there always. And so we need to shift and adapt. But I think it's going to be different for each crop. It's going to be different for each farmer. But I think it's something everybody's thinking about. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, everyone, for the questions. I should start by saying something about the content of your presentation, but I'm going to start with form. It was terrific and super helpful that you started off with your 3 questions. It kept us grounded in what you were saying. The arc of your presentation was visible at all times, and so that made for a very easy to follow presentation, and so thank you for that. But content. You said that it was depressing. You were asked whether you were hopeful, but you know the alternative to being depressed is being unaware. And so we are now more aware than we were 90 minutes ago, which is a fabulous thing. You warned us not to be complacent. When you're aware, then you are better able to avoid complacency, and avoiding complacency is something I think you've helped us with a ton tonight. So thank you so much for this presentation. I've got 3 public service announcements. So to channel Jennifer, first question is, how many presentations, how many PSAs do I have? Well, I have 3, so now you can follow me along. The first is to say that the next Northumberland Learning Connection event is this Saturday. There's a farm tour at the Burnham Farm out on Highway 2 towards Port Hope. We have a handful of tickets left. That'll be at 3 o'clock on Saturday. And so if anyone's interested, you go on the NLC website, and the tickets are available through the website while they last. So that's an outing on Saturday. The next formal session is next Thursday here. It'll be on food insecurity, but at a slightly more local level than the broader topic that we had today. That's number 2. And the third is that next, gotta find the date, October 28th at 7 p.m., the Horizons of Friendship is presenting a documentary called The Coburg Connection, which is going to follow the history and founding of this very important local NGO. And so if people are interested, that's going to be playing at the Coburg Public Library, October 28th, 7 p.m., Horizons of Friendship. And that's 3. So good night, everybody, and thank you for coming.